All right. I'm afraid I don't have any pictures of things exploding, but I do have some nice graphs. Hopefully that'll be a good substitute. So I was in Washington, D.C. a couple of weeks ago and noticed a quote that I was familiar with by Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, inscribed on the front of the IRS building. Taxes are what we pay for civilized society. So obviously the first purpose of the tax system is to raise revenue to support public services that people are demanding through their elected representatives. When we talk about tax policy, the issues that I want to focus on here are the two that I think are central to most of the public discussion and debate surrounding taxes. And that has to do with exactly the way in which we raise revenue. And there are two issues there. One is an issue of fairness. To a certain extent, or to a great extent, that's in the eye of the beholder, but we have to know how taxes affect people in different circumstances before we can begin to make any judgment about whether they are fair or unfair. And the second issue, particularly at the state level, that's dominated much of the debate, has to do with incentives built into the tax system. When we decide to tax certain things and not tax other things, or base taxes on certain kinds of activity, not other kinds of activity, we're creating a system of incentives to do things or not do other things. And we need to think about whether we're serving a public purpose by directing people's or influencing people's behavior in that way. So when we talk about fairness and the tax system, you have to talk about how the tax system redistributes income. The income redistribution is not some socialist idea that needs to be kept out of the tax system. It's an inevitable part of the tax system. If you have a tax system, you're redistributing income in some way, and you need to know what that is before you can make any judgments about it. The question is, how do we want it to redistribute income, not whether we want it to or not. So let's look a little bit at the distribution of income and how it's changed recently. This is looking at what's happened over the 27-year period, 1979 to 2006. And when we look at income distribution, the most common thing is to divide the population into quintiles according to income. The bottom fifth of the 20% of the population with the lowest annual incomes, the top fifth, obviously the richest 20%. And because the income distribution is so skewed, there's some very high incomes at the top, it's important to break down that top fifth and look at the top 5% or the top 1% or the top richest 400 families even and see what's happened to those folks. So this is not just the tax system or just the economy, it's both together. It's what's happened to the distribution of income because of what's been going on in the way the economy has rewarded people in different occupations and circumstances, and how federal, state, and local governments have taxed that income. The bottom fifth of the population of that 27 years, their real incomes, corrected for inflation, went up 11%. The top 1%, their incomes rose 256%. So the late 70s was a period when we began to reverse a post-war trend towards greater equality in the distribution of income. And that reversal has continued unabated in the 30 years since then. That's the same thing in numbers, so we're going to skip that. This is putting it a little more historical perspective, looking at two 30-year periods, the 30 years immediately following World War II and the subsequent 30 years. the middle to late 70s being when that, what some people call the great U-turn, when the income distribution started becoming more and more unequal. So what's this telling us? Per capita income doesn't tell us anything about the distribution. It just tells us whether overall the population is better off or not in terms of material income. Again, this is corrected for inflation using consumer price index. So a 90% increase in per capita income in the post-war area, 64%, 76, 2006. Growth, not quite as strong, but still quite a bit of growth in incomes. But in that earlier period, the bottom 90% of the households got 83% of the gains in income. Top 1% still got a disproportionate share, but still only 20%. In the subsequent period, the bottom 90% of the population got only 10% of the growth in income. Excuse me, I'm not reading that right. Excuse me, the bottom 90% in the earlier period, their incomes rose by 83%. The top 1%, their real incomes rose by only 20%. So the distribution was becoming more equal because the bottom 90% was gaining more rapidly. We had real wage growth, and we had the social programs of the 1960s that are part of this as well, the transfer programs that helped equalize income. So in the subsequent period, the bottom 90%, their incomes grew only 10%. The top 1% experienced a 232% growth in income. This is another way of looking at it, going back a little earlier to the 1920s, the Roaring '20s, which were clearly roaring if you were in the top 1% of the population. This is the share of income growth, which is the way I started to try to explain the last graph, not the growth in your income, but what share of it went to the bottom 90%, the top 1%. So what we've experienced in 2002 to 2007 is very reminiscent of what we experienced in 1923 to 1929. We all know what happened at the end of each of those periods. The economy collapsed. As opposed to the way the gains in income were distributed in the 60s and the 70s in particular, when most of the gains went much more broadly throughout the population instead of being concentrated at the top. And this is just another way of looking at it, the income share now of pre-tax income. So this is what's going on in the private economy as it affects the incomes of the very rich, starting in 1913 and going to, maybe you can read that, I can, 2006, I think. Okay. So there's the great U-turn in the late 60s and early 70s when the incomes of the very rich stopped declining as a share of total income and started increasing again. And we're back up now to almost to where we were in 1929. All right, so how has the tax system affected the distribution of income? We need to talk about different kinds of taxes. We generally use three descriptors: regressive, proportional, and progressive. This is just a hypothetical example. Regressivity or progressivity is defined by how the percentage of your income that goes to taxes changes as income increases. It's not the dollar amount, it's the share of your income that you pay in taxes. A regressive tax is one where the richer you get, the smaller the share of your income goes to taxes. The most regressive tax would be something like a poll tax. Flat dollar amount for everybody, obviously a much higher share of your income the poorer you are. Proportional tax, exactly the same percentage from everybody. We don't really have any of those. It's pretty hard to achieve. And a progressive tax is obviously one where the average tax rate, the tax you pay as a percentage of your income, rises with income. So here's what the federal income tax looks like. It's a real moving target. This is from the Tax Policy Center as of 2010. Again, we're looking at it by income quintiles. The bottom one there is minus 5%. How can we have a negative income tax rate? Anybody know what's going on there? Credits. Which one in particular? The earned income tax credit. Yeah, so it's a substantial amount for people at the bottom of the income distribution. It's generally considered part of the income tax system, not a separate transfer program. So that's why you get the tax system transferring money to low-income households, and there we have at the top quintile the effective rate, 15%. Now, some of you have memorized Collins' earlier graph of the top marginal income tax rate. You might have noticed that it's settled down around 35% in the last few years. So how come that number is only 15%? The marginal rate is the rate that applies only to income above a certain level. These rates, you take your total tax that you owe, divide it by your income. So even if you're rich, you don't pay any federal income tax on the first $15,000 or $20,000 of your income. We hold, it's probably even more than that if you're a family. So why do we have a progressive income tax? What are the arguments that have been made for progressivity? And there are a number of different kinds of arguments. One is that simply that the private market, left to its own devices, generates a very unequal distribution of income, and that simply isn't fair. In a civilized society, we ought to not allow large segments of the population to be poor, to live below a subsistence level. And so you leave free from tax in a progressive income tax system a large chunk of income, or most state tax systems, a little tiny chunk of income. But you leave that free of tax because that's the subsistence amount that people need to get by. That's one argument for progressive tax. And even a flat tax, as some people have proposed, which simply means the marginal rate for everybody is the same, is progressive because even the flat tax proposals exempt some income at the bottom. So if you pay zero on the first $20,000 of your income, then you pay 20% on the next $20,000, your average rate is still, if you got $40,000 income, you're only paying 20% on half of it. So your average rate is 10%. That's how that 15% rate gets to be what it is with a top marginal rate of 35%. Another argument for progressivity is an insurance one. If you sort of thought about what kind of a tax system you'd like to have as you set out in the working world, it'd be nice to have one that left you alone when you were not making any money, when you were out of a job, when you're just starting a business, had no income to pay taxes with. And if things worked out well and you got a good paying job or your business did really well, that's when you pay your taxes. That's really what a progressive tax system does. So it's not just among different people at a point in time. It's think about how it affects you over your lifetime. It taxes you a lot when you're doing really well, and it taxes you very little or not at all when you're not doing so well. So what's happened to the tax system in the last 10 years? That's what the income tax. Oh, this is the same graph. You've seen that before. Now you know what a marginal income tax rate is, sort of. So that great socialist Dwight Eisenhower had a 91% marginal income tax rate throughout his presidency. If you look at 1950 to 1960 era, 52 to 60. All right, what's been happening in the last 10 years? This is how the tax cuts, the major tax cuts of 2001 and 2003 that we're arguing about now at the national level. The argument is, should we let them expire? Should we continue them? Should we let them expire only for people making more than $250,000 or $300,000 a year? This is the impact those tax cuts had by those same, by 3 quintiles and by the top 1%. So what we're showing here is how those tax cuts increased the after-tax income of different households. And clearly they were skewed heavily towards the top. Top 1% experienced almost a 7% increase in after-tax income as a result of these tax cuts. And they're already making, obviously, much, much more than the people at the bottom who got a 0.4% increase in their after-tax income. So these are very top-heavy tax cuts, which means that they made the income tax system, the federal income tax, less progressive. And this is just another way of looking at the same two tax cuts, how they work out in terms of who gets the benefits. The top 1% got 31% of the tax cuts. The top 20% got 74% of the tax cuts. So, yeah, everybody got a little bit. Everybody got something. But by and large, the tax cuts went to rich people. Another way of looking at it, putting these tax cuts in perspective, is to compare it to the poverty gap. Poverty gap is the difference between household income for people who are poor and the poverty level. The gap between what it would take to bring their income up to the poverty level so they wouldn't be poor anymore. This is an example of what the gap was for families on average and for individuals. The average family in poverty had an income of $10,000. They'd need another $8,500 to bring them up to the poverty level. So you could add the poverty gap up for all the poor families and individuals in the whole country, and you get a very large number. It happens to be only slightly larger than the value of the 2001-2003 tax cuts just to the top 1%. So in other words, it take $122 billion a year to eliminate poverty. $117 billion of that could be financed by rolling back just the tax cuts on the top 1% of income tax earners. And I'm going to skip that one. All right. So if you listen to the Tea Party folks, you would assume that tax rates must have gone up a lot recently. This is the effective federal income tax rate on either the top 400 households or households with incomes over $1 million. And what's happened to it from 1992 to 2007. Effective tax rate, which had been pretty recently, over 30%, dropped to a little over 16% for the top 400 households, a little higher for people earning over $1 million a year. More to the point, this is the average federal income tax rate for a median income family of 4. Longer historical perspective, we're looking 1955 to 2010. So the average tax rate almost got to 12% in the mid-70s, in the early 80s, I guess. And it has fallen ever since and is now more like 4%. So even average taxes have actually been on the decline. All right, so what we've been looking at is the federal income tax. That's all. That's just one part of the tax system. I'm going to look at state and local taxes, and I'm going to look at Iowa because I can't look at all 50 states. To some extent, similar things have been happening in Iowa, but we happen to be a much more egalitarian state in terms of our income distribution. This is the ratio of the income of the richest 20% of the families to the poorest 20% of the families. The higher the ratio, the more unequal the distribution of income. You can see we're in a group of unshaded states there with the lowest ratio, but even still we have seen some of the same income trends that we've seen nationally in terms of what's happened to the income gains, where have they gone. This is the last 2 decades. Obviously, the top 20% of Iowans experienced almost a 50% increase in income. The bottom 20%, 14% over that period. Well, what have we done in the last 20 years tax-wise in the state of Iowa? The 3 major trends are we increased the sales tax. It used to be 4% in the beginning of the 90s. Now, statewide, it's close to 7% when you add the local taxes that we've allowed in that period. Sales tax went up a whole bunch. Major cuts in the income tax in the late 90s. And significant cuts in business taxes, significant expenditure on tax credits that have reduced business taxes, and a failure to address loopholes in the corporate income tax that many states have addressed and that we have yet to tackle. So what about these other taxes? We saw the income tax was quite progressive. This is what a regressive tax looks like. This is the Iowa sales tax. What you pay as a percent of your income. A couple of income levels. The bottom 20% of Iowa families earns on average $10,500 and pay 6.5% of their income in taxes. Now that includes the share of business sales taxes that get passed on to households. It actually includes some excise taxes. You're wondering how it could be 6.5% when food is exempt. That's how it gets up there. Quite a regressive tax. Percent declines pretty dramatically. The Iowa income tax is progressive up to a point, and then it pretty much levels off. Nowhere near as progressive as the federal. No state tax, income tax, I think it's fair to say, is as progressive as the federal. The property tax would look something in between, but more like the sales tax. This is what the overall tax system looks like. Downward sloping curve. The percentage of your income you pay declines the more income you get. And this only shows it up to, I think that's the top quintile, $209,000 in income, or it might be the close to it. We decline a little bit further if we could take it all the way up to $1 million. Here's another way of looking at it that's more complicated. but it adds the three taxes together, comes to pretty much the same conclusion. I'm going to skip over that one. All right, so I need to set up the next slide. We got a federal system. We got federal income taxes, quite progressive. We've got state and local tax systems that look a lot like Iowa's. They're all regressive. Pretty much, the state that has an income tax and no sales tax might have a slightly progressive tax system. Not sure. But on the whole, the state and local tax system is adding a significant regressive element to the overall tax system. So what's all this about? 47% of the people aren't paying any taxes. Some people who use that statistic may have used it correctly, which is that about 47% of federal income tax payers do not pay any tax. By the time it's gotten bandied about in talk radio and cable news shows, what people hear, I think, is 47% of the people aren't paying any taxes, and I'm paying for them, because I know I pay some. There are a few things wrong with that, and I think this is a good point to bring in what the overall tax system looks like. First of all, at the federal level, individual income tax is less than half of total tax revenue. A big chunk is payroll taxes for social insurance, Medicare, and Social Security. The corporate income tax, 14.4%. It's a significant federal revenue source. It's not a very significant state revenue source. Then we've got federal excise taxes on tires and gasoline, another 4%. The payroll taxes are proportional up to a point, and then you don't pay any anymore. So overall, they are a regressive tax, because if you got $1 million or $200,000, you pay the same payroll taxes. Percent of your income, it declines. So if we talk about the individual income tax, we're talking about less than half of the federal tax system. We've left out local taxes, which are about a third of the total tax revenue, state and local taxes. And as we saw, that's a regressive component of the tax system, the state and local tax system. If we put the two together, federal taxes, state and local taxes, by the type of tax, what do we get? Individual income taxes, mostly federal, but also including state. That's why it's up to 38% of the tax revenue. Still, the largest single way of raising revenue is through the income tax. The next biggest is, those colors are bad. I think that's property taxes over there, the 22.6%. They're even worse on here. Yep, that's property taxes. Okay, the next biggest is property. The 13% is federal excise taxes, state and local sales taxes, gross receipts taxes. They're all taxes on things we buy. About 11% from corporate income taxes, mostly federal. So a good chunk of the tax system is not progressive. The corporate income tax and the individual income tax are both progressive taxes. Property taxes are not. Excise, sales, and gross receipts taxes are distinctly regressive. And the payroll tax, that's the, I got my colors mixed up. They are so similar. Sorry, 22.6% is payroll. 10% is property. At any rate, most of those taxes at the top half of that pie chart are regressive. Now, because of the substantial progressivity of the federal income tax. When you put this all together and ask, what does the tax system do to the distribution of income? It's the question we started with. It does, for the most part, make the distribution of income a little more equal. That grayish purple thing represents income from the private market. In other words, pre-tax income, what share of pre-tax income goes to the richest fifth of the population? 53.5%. So 53.5% roughly of all the stuff we produce in the economy goes to satisfy the demands of the richest 20% of the population, is one way of looking at it. That's market income. The red is after federal taxes, and you can see that's the major impact for most of the income groups, is what happens when we impose federal taxes. Some groups' share goes up. Doesn't mean they have more money after federal taxes necessarily. It means they have a bigger share of post-tax income. We've shrunk the whole pie because we've taken some income taxes out of it. Now we ask, okay, who gets what share of that? How do the shares change? Share of the rich goes down to about 50%. Every other group increases at least a little bit in terms of their share of the income pie. And the numbers there refer to the yellow bar, which is after federal, state, and local taxes, that don't change things a whole lot, except that those regressive taxes at the bottom actually leave people worse off in that bottom 20%. Now, I didn't get to any of my stuff about business taxes in Iowa, but I'm probably running out of time, right? A little bit? Okay. All right. Mostly what I wanted to talk about was the incentive issue, which, as I said, was largely a debate, but not exclusively, at the state level, because states have become so competitive with one another, and localities as well, for business activity. So we look at Iowa. This is what has happened to overall revenue going into the state general fund, and what has happened to business tax credits from 2006 through the estimate for next fiscal year and what those credits are going to cost us. It's an index graph, meaning we put both figures as to what they were in 2006, set that number equal to 100 so we can compare the rates of growth. The point is, revenues went up a little bit, the recession hit, they went back down. We're about where we were 5 years ago in terms of revenues. Business tax credits, on the other hand, have about doubled over that same period. So this is a significant issue. It's $300 or $400 million a year that we are spending on business tax credits, and we ought to be taking more seriously, and we hopefully are going to be taking more seriously the question of whether we are getting what we expect to get from those tax cuts, which is more business activity. That's largely the rationale. So we provide incentives for creating jobs, for building new plants, for doing research activities, conducting research in Iowa. And we have a whole variety of ways of giving out money in the form of tax credits. So let me just talk a little bit about credits. First of all, do we have to do this because we're a high tax place? No. We are actually below average in terms of taxes. The left graph is taxes as a percent of all the income earned in the state. Taxes as a percent of total income for the U.S. as a whole. State and local taxes as a percent of income for the U.S. as a whole, and then for Iowa. We're below the U.S. average. We rank 26th among the states. Corporate income tax, we're below the average, and we rank 38th. So why do we need to give tax credits? Well, this is an area that I've been doing research in, and the way you approach a question like that if you're an economist is to say, okay, if credits and tax cuts to business are producing the jobs and the investments that they're supposed to, we should be able to observe that over time. We should be able to see that states that have cut taxes more aggressively grow faster. That's the objective. Is it happening? There's reason to believe, to begin with, that it doesn't happen very much for the simple reason that state and local taxes in total, property taxes, sales taxes, state corporate income taxes, or if you're not a corporation, state personal income taxes, they're about 1% of the cost of doing business or less. That's all you have to work with if you're trying to get business to come to Iowa through the tax code. You don't have a lot of leverage when you're only working with 1% of their costs. Labor is 20 times as important. So is the labor here that they need, is it skilled? They have the skills that they need. And what are wage rates? It's a much bigger determinant, much more important one than taxes. It has to be. And the results of this analysis, you do a regression analysis, you try to control for all the things that are likely to affect business activity and economic growth. And you find out that, lo and behold, taxes don't matter very much. And tax incentives to attract business don't matter very much. To the point that when you have a general program that provides tax breaks for new business activity, at a level of incentives or tax cuts that's typical of states across the country, on average, you can say that in 90% of the cases, the tax cuts didn't accomplish anything. It didn't matter. The firm came here, they got the tax break, they would have been here anyway because there were so many other economic reasons for them to be here. A wind turbine manufacturer locates in Iowa because it's a windy state. There's a lot of turbines being built, and you don't want to ship those across the country. You've all seen them on the highways. That's why they're here, not because we gave them a tax break. So it becomes a very expensive tool if most of the money is going to firms that would have been here anyway. You're spending a lot of money to affect a small number of business decisions. And in the process, you're depriving the state of revenues. And if you think about what state government does to promote economic growth in the long run, it provides essential services, particularly educating the labor force. This is where the state budget goes. If you're talking about cutting the budget, you're talking about cutting education. You can't really cut the state budget without cutting education when over half of the budget is going to education. Health and Human Services, another 22%. Justice, the court system, the prison system, the state patrol, another 12%. So at a time when the economy is demanding a more educated labor force, we are cutting revenues to the state general fund, cutting state revenues going to the regents' institutions and community colleges, which turn around and raise tuition and make the education system less affordable and less accessible. And so we're shooting ourselves in the foot. That's my argument.